guys, Mr. Klein here, and we are going over the second lesson of our chapter, which is on Athenian democracy. So let's go ahead and let's get started. Now, when we think of democracy, we think of our government here in the United States. But where did it come from? Well, Greece is the birthplace of that government, the democracy. And let's go ahead and let's define the term right here and now. A democracy is a type of government in which people rule themselves. Okay? It's a type of government where the people rule themselves. And the city where democracy was born is Athens, Greece. Okay? So Athens is still the capital of Greece. So let's zoom in. And you remember we talked about in the last lesson about the Parthenon and on the Acropolis and stuff like that. In Athens, but as we look across the city of Athens, and as we look across Athens, we have a very rich and very long history, and it took a while to actually get to the point where the people were actually ruling themselves here in Athens. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's get going and let's talk about that. Because as you can see, I have a wall of text and a lot of heads on the side of the board to look at. Now, it all started with a group of rich landowners, and we call these people aristocrats. And generally, in ancient civilizations, and even until, in some countries even today, aristocrats hold a lot of power. They're rich landowners and they own land. Now, I know your parents might own a couple acres and have a small farm. We're not talking about them as aristocrats. We're talking about people who own hundreds of acres and are millionaires. And these were the richest people in Athens. And the type of government where only a few people have power is known as an oligarchy. And Athens originally started, remember the last lesson we talked about the city-states having their own unique forms of government. Athens was an oligarchy. And the aristocrats were the ones who held power. They held power because they were the richest men in town, and they were the richest traders and things like that. And as a result, the aristocrats dominated Athenian government, and common people had very little to say in their government, even though most of the population of Athens was actually common people. Now, a group of rebels did try to overthrow the aristocrats, and it failed. As a result, a man named Draco created, not Draco Malloy from Harry Potter, but Draco created a very strict set of laws. And this is the first head we're going to look at. Okay, he created a very strict set of strict laws in response to the Draconian Constitution. And among these laws, there's lots of them. There are lots of strict. They were very, very strict. And a lot of them involved being sentenced to death for not following the laws. Kind of like the Qin dynasty when we were talking about, and Shi Huangdi, kind of just killing everyone. And among these laws was to make loitering, which is standing around in a public area for too long, punishable by death. So you couldn't just, hang out for an obnoxious period of time. Nowadays, you do that, the cops kind of come by and tell you to get along your way. And under the Draconian Constitution, you would be sentenced to death. Now, strangely enough, the Athenians thought that these laws were much too strict. And the successor of Draco was a man named Solon. And Solon created laws that were much less strict and gave more rights to commoners. And statute head number 2 is right here. This is Solon. Solon was called Solon the Lawgiver. He was considered to be very wise, and his sets of laws were laying the foundation slowly but surely for democracy. Now, this was the big change. In order to keep the common people from revolting and killing all of the aristocrats, Solon allowed a compromise to be made and allowed all free men who were not slaves, to become citizens in Athens, or people who had the right to participate in government. He allowed all free men to participate in government to a limited extent. But even then, that was not enough for the common people, which also included wealthy people who didn't own land and weren't considered part of the aristocracy. They were tired of the aristocracy, and a nobleman named Pisistratus overthrew the oligarchy himself and set himself in charge. and he became Athens' first tyrant. And a tyrant is a leader who held power through the use of force. Now, nowadays, usually when we think of a tyrant, we think of someone whose rule is cruel. But Athenian tyrants were usually good leaders. And here's what happened. Pisistratus, statue head number 3 right here, Pisistratus put himself in charge, but kept the government, the constitution in place. He and the people didn't like who was running it. They wanted a fair say in the government. So what Pisistratus did was put himself in charge and enforce the Athenian constitution. And if people opposed him, then he would use the army to crush them. Tyrants stayed in power because of large armies who swore loyalty to them, and the people generally supported them. They liked these guys who pushed around people who opposed the government because the people of Athens were very proud of being Athenians, and they wanted their government to represent them. Now, the final tyrant was a son of Pisistratus, and which was a man that the people did not like, along with the aristocrats. And the aristocrats ended up convincing a rival city-state to attack Athens, and the Athenians lost, and as a result, the aristocrats were able to take back over. The people kind of liked him, but in general, the aristocrats didn't really like him. So, into all this chaos and carnage and people not liking the aristocrats who were in charge sets the stage for democracy. And so this is a huge wall of text. But if you live in the United States or you live in a country that isn't the United States as a democratic form of government, a lot of this will make common sense and it'll just be, oh, okay, this is where all of these ideas came from. So, a new leader came to power, was aristocrat himself, named Cleisthenes. And Cleisthenes was from one of the powerful aristocratic families. He managed to overthrow the oligarchy for good because he was able to call on the support of the people. And this is a modern marble statue of Cleisthenes. So we're on marble statue head number 4 in our list. Cleisthenes was kind of the best of both worlds. He was an aristocrat that most of the aristocrats liked, but also the people liked themselves too. As a result, he had a wide range of support all throughout Athens. And so he allowed the establishment of democracy, which gives him the term the father of democracy. And an Athenian democracy, so this is where we're going to go from here. This is the government Cleisthenes allowed to get set up. Now you remember, all free men were already citizens and could participate in government, but their participation was limited. Cleisthenes kind of threw the door open for everyone to participate. So let's look at what democracy looked like in Athens right here. All free men had the right in the assembly that created the city's laws. So in other words, if you were a free man, you could pop up while people were voting, give your own 2 cents, and vote on it and help create city's laws. They met outdoors so that everyone could attend. Athens was a large city, so you had a lot of potential citizens. In the meetings, people usually gave up and gave speeches on important issues that were important to them and for Athens themselves. And after the speeches were over, the people voted, usually by a show of hands. So if you've ever been in a class and go, all those in favor of whatever, raise your hand, that is how the Athenians voted. Okay, now although the number of people changed from day to day, after all, if you were a plumber and you were busy fixing someone's toilet during the day, you couldn't always show up to vote in the assembly. For major issues, however, the assembly needed about 6,000 free men to vote. And this idea of needing a certain amount of people to vote is known as a quorum. And in modern democracies and assemblies, you need a certain number of people in the assembly to sit and vote, and that's what we call a quorum. But usually what would happen is when you had important events is that slaves would go throughout the city with red cords with kind of paint or chalk on them. And they would walk around, and any free man who had the red chalk on them was required by law to go and vote. And if not, he would have to pay penalties because democracy was considered to be that important to the Athenians. And like I said right here, slaves would go into the town to gather more citizens, and they would use that red cord. And because the assembly was so large, and you ended up, Athens kept on growing and growing and growing, Athenians ended up selecting citizens to be city officials and help decide which issues the assembly should discuss. So as the democracy grew on, it kind of got too improper, not so much improper, but unwieldy to have every single little issue, like, well, your neighbor's dog is pooping on my yard. I think we need to have a vote in order to ban this person from Athens. Well, the city officials would look at that issue and say, you know what, I don't think that's important enough for the for the entire assembly to vote on. So over time, citizens gained more and more rights. They served on juries to decide court cases. So yes, the idea of trial by jury also came from the Athenians. Juries on court cases had anywhere between 200 and 6,000 people, but usually about 500 people would serve on a jury. The number was always an odd number of jurors in order to prevent ties. So essentially, you would have a court case and it put the jury to vote. If the majority voted to clear the person, they would be considered innocent. If more people voted guilty, they would be considered guilty. Now, this system worked for about 170 years, which isn't too bad in the grand scheme of things. And it reached its height under the leadership of Pericles. And this is marble statue head number 5. Pericles is considered one of the most important leaders of ancient civilization because he encouraged Athenians to participate in government. And some of the ideas of what democracies consider good citizenship comes from Pericles. And we're going to read some words of Pericles because he was a brilliant speaker, a brilliant general, a brilliant politician. And I'm pretty sure he was probably good at sports too, because like if you're good at everything, you just have to be great at everything. And Pericles is a really important guy in history. He believed it wasn't just important for people to participate in government. He believed it was just as important to participate in government as defending Athens in war. What he essentially said was defending Athens in war is one thing, but being a good citizen is just as important. Now, all good things come to an end. And eventually Athenian democracy fell when invaders from the north of Greece, known as the Macedonians, came in and swept over. Even though the Macedonian king ruled like a tyrant, he ended up letting the Athenian assembly keep their powers, albeit in a pretty limited circumstance. They could keep it on limited circumstances, and if he had to, he could overrule the Athenian democracy's rule. They tried their best not to upset the king because they liked ruling themselves and they were fiercely independent. But eventually a new king took over and extinguished or ended the Athenian democratic experiment forever. After that, Athens, in terms of the city-state government, was never ruled like that. But democracy kept on popping up here and there and eventually came to where it's at today. Now, when we hear democracy, we think of the United States. So let's look at the differences between the Athenian democracy and the United States democracy. Well, first off, and it isn't in the notes, is the fact of who's a citizen. In Athens, you had to be a native-born Athenian, so you couldn't move from another city-state to Athens to become a citizen. You had to be born in Athens, and you kind of had to own land, and you had to be a free man. Now, later on, the land ownership was kind of tossed out, so you had to be born in Athens and be a free man. In the United States, we have what's known as universal suffrage, where anybody, all people are considered citizens, but in particular, people who can vote are any people who are not felons, those are people who commit crimes, certain types of crimes, can participate in government. Now, like ancient Athens, the United States does have a democratic government. But our modern democracy is very different from ancient Athens. And in fact, a lot of our structures go on ancient Rome, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. All citizens in Athens could participate directly in the government. Everybody could go and vote in every single issue, making it what we call a direct democracy. Because at the time of this recording, the United States has over 300 million people, probably 2/3 of them are voting citizens, it's too large for direct democracy to work. Because it's too impractical to have people from Hawaii and Florida and Maine and Alaska to all get together and vote on issues. As a result, the democracy created by the founders of the United States is what we call a representative democracy, or what I like to call a republic. Okay? And we'll talk about the finer details of a republic in the chapter on Rome. In this system, citizens elect officials to represent them in the government. Okay, that's the House of Representatives and the Senate. These elected officials then meet to make the country's laws as well as to enforce them. And this goes all the way down to the local city, or in Louisiana where we have the parish. Like where we live, we have a city council. The people of the city vote for the city council. The city councilmen all meet together and they vote on the city's issues. And as a result, Americans don't vote on every law that's passed, but rather they trust the chosen representatives to vote for them. And so that's a big thing in elections in the United States, is that you have people saying in the campaign, well, you need to vote for me because I will speak for you in government. Because that's the idea that the United States has, is that a representative should speak for the people. So, big, huge lesson right here. Really important stuff on the Athenian democracy. And it started out with aristocrats, which were rich landowners, forming an oligarchy, a government of the few. You had people like, on the course of democracy, you had people like Draco, who would kill people for standing around too long in one place. You had Pisistratus becoming the first tyrant and ruling by force. And eventually you led to Cleisthenes, this guy, founding the Greek democracy where all free men could vote and decide on issues with the city. And the Greek democracy met its height under the leadership of Pericles, who was the leader of Athens, who kept on getting elected over and over because he was such a great leader. And he believed that the best citizens didn't just fight for their country, but also participated. Of course, the democracy ended up falling, but it set the stage and it set the tradition for our government in the United States and most of the Western world today. So there you go. That's the lesson. And if you have any questions, please let me know. And thanks for watching.